In 356 BC, in the ancient city of Pella, a boy was born who would change the fate of the world. His name was Alexander. By the age of 20 he was already a king. By 25 he had crushed the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. And by 30 he ruled lands stretching from Greece to Egypt, from Persia to the edge of India. But Alexander was more than just a conqueror. He was a dreamer who believed in uniting the world under one banner, one culture, one vision. Was he a genius of strategy, or simply a man consumed by endless ambition? His campaigns carved new maps, spread ideas across continents, and left a legacy that still shapes our world today. This is the story of Alexander the Great, the boy who became a legend, the king who became a god in the eyes of his people, and the man whose name still echoes across time. Before we begin this journey through history, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon, because here the past isn't just told, it's brought to life. Alexander the Great's story begins long before he set foot on the battlefields of Asia. To understand the man who would one day shake the foundations of the ancient world, we must first look at his childhood in Macedonia, the northern Greek kingdom that produced him. Born in 356 BC in the city of Pella, Alexander was the son of King Philip II and Queen Olympias. His birth was said to have been marked by omens and prophecies, fueling the belief that his destiny was far greater than that of an ordinary prince. According to ancient writers, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the grand sanctuary of one of Greece's most revered goddesses, caught fire on the very night Alexander was born. Some interpreted this as a sign that the goddess was absent, too busy watching over the birth of a child who would change the world. Macedonia at the time was seen by many southern Greeks as a rough, semi-barbaric land on the edge of civilization. Yet under Philip II, it was quickly rising to power. Philip had transformed Macedonia's army into the most efficient military force of its age. With reforms in tactics, weaponry, and discipline, he created a machine capable of crushing the proud Greek city-states one after another. For young Alexander, growing up in this environment meant witnessing the transformation of his homeland into a dominant power. His father's success was a constant reminder of the weight of kingship and the expectation that one day he too would lead. From his earliest days, Alexander's mother Olympias instilled in him a sense of divine destiny. Olympias was a deeply religious woman, devoted to the worship of Dionysus and the mysteries of her native Epirus. Legends claim she told her son that he was descended from heroes and gods. Later, when Alexander came to be called son of Zeus, it was partly because Olympias had nurtured this belief from his youth. In her eyes, her son was not just an ordinary prince. He was chosen for greatness. The combination of Philip's political genius and Olympias's spiritual influence shaped Alexander's dual sense of responsibility and ambition. As a boy, Alexander was noted for his quick mind and fiery temper. Ancient accounts describe him as eager to prove himself, unwilling to accept limits, and driven by an insatiable curiosity. These traits became most evident in his education. Recognizing the importance of intellectual training, Philip sought out the greatest teacher he could find for his son. He secured none other than Aristotle, the famous philosopher and student of Plato. For several years, Alexander and a group of young Macedonian nobles studied under Aristotle at Mysa, in a sanctuary-like setting surrounded by gardens, streams, and groves. Under Aristotle, Alexander learned philosophy, ethics, politics, poetry, and the sciences. He was introduced to Homer's Iliad, which became his lifelong companion. He carried a copy with him on his campaigns, reportedly keeping it under his pillow at night. For Alexander, the heroes of Homer's epic, especially Achilles, were not just characters in a story. They were role models, embodying courage, honor, and the pursuit of everlasting glory. The influence of Homer and Aristotle shaped Alexander's worldview. He came to believe that greatness was achieved through deeds that outlived one's lifetime. This sense of destiny and desire for eternal fame never left him. Yet Alexander's education was not confined to books. His father ensured that the prince also mastered the arts of war and leadership. From an early age, Alexander was trained in horsemanship, weapon handling, and battlefield tactics. One of the most famous stories of his childhood illustrates his determination and skill. A horse named Bucephalus, a massive and untamable beast, was brought before Philip. None of his men could ride it, and Philip was about to dismiss the animal when young Alexander, only 12 years old, stepped forward. Observing the horse's behavior, he realized it was afraid of its own shadow. Turning the animal toward the sun, Alexander calmed it and mounted successfully. When Philip saw this, he is said to have declared, "My son, you must seek a kingdom greater than Macedonia, for Macedonia is too small for you." Bucephalus would later carry Alexander through many of his greatest battles, becoming almost as legendary as the king himself. Alexander's relationship with his father was complex. He admired Philip's brilliance as a general and statesman, but he also resented his father's conquests. Each time Philip extended Macedonia's power, Alexander feared there would be nothing left for him to achieve. This tension fueled his ambition. He was determined not only to equal his father but to surpass him. Olympius, who often clashed with Philip, reinforced this drive by reminding Alexander of his divine heritage. Between his parents, Alexander inherited both the sharp pragmatism of a warrior king and the burning conviction of a chosen hero. During his teenage years, Alexander began to prove himself in military affairs. At the age of 16, when Philip was away on campaign, he left Alexander as regent in Macedonia. During this time, a neighboring Thracian tribe revolted. Rather than wait for his father, Alexander raised an army, crushed the rebellion, and founded a city in the conquered territory, naming it Alexandropolis after himself. It was a bold act for a boy not yet 17, and it showed the Macedonians that their young prince had the courage and decisiveness of a leader. Not long after, Alexander fought alongside Philip in the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. This battle pitted Macedonia against a coalition of Greek city-states, including Athens and Thebes. During the fighting, Alexander commanded the Macedonian cavalry on one wing. His charge broke through the enemy line and played a crucial role in securing victory. At only 18 years old, Alexander had already demonstrated his ability as a commander on the battlefield. The victory at Chaeronea solidified Macedonia's dominance over Greece, and Alexander's performance marked him as a worthy heir. But life in Philip's court was never simple. Politics in Macedonia were dangerous, with rivalries, betrayals, and shifting alliances. Alexander often found himself caught between his father's ambitions and his mother's influence. At times, his relationship with Philip became strained, especially when Philip remarried and threatened Alexander's position as heir. Despite these conflicts, Philip never dismissed his son's abilities. He knew Alexander possessed qualities that could not be ignored. By the time Philip was assassinated in 336 BC, Alexander was just 20 years old. Yet even before inheriting the throne, his childhood and youth had prepared him for greatness. From Olympius, he inherited a belief in divine destiny. From Aristotle, he gained a love of learning and an ideal of heroic glory. From Philip, he absorbed military skill and political vision. The foundations of Alexander's legend were already in place long before he became king. The boy from Pella, shaped by gods, teachers, and kings, was now ready to step into history. His childhood in Macedonia was not simply the story of a prince. It was the forging of a conqueror whose ambition would carry him beyond the limits of the known world. The Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC marked the turning point in Alexander's youth and the moment when the world first recognized his extraordinary leadership. It was here, at the age of 18, that the Prince of Macedonia proved himself not merely as the son of Philip II, but as a force in his own right. This chapter traces Alexander's rise as a prince, his first true test on the battlefield, and the reputation that began to surround him long before he became king. When Alexander returned from his early education under Aristotle, he was already intellectually gifted and admired for his sharp reasoning, but the time had come to demonstrate his abilities in action. Macedonia was at the height of its expansion under Philip II, and Philip's dream was to unite all of Greece under his rule. The Greek city-states, however, were not willing to surrender their independence without resistance. Athens, proud of its democratic tradition, and Thebes, famed for its military discipline, formed an alliance against Macedonia. The two powers called upon smaller city-states to join them, and soon a coalition of Greek forces had gathered to stop Philip's advance. The stage was set at Chaeronea, a town in Boeotia. Philip marched with his veteran army, while Alexander rode alongside him as commander of the companion cavalry, the elite horsemen of Macedonia. For the young prince, this was no training exercise, no mock lesson. It was the decisive clash that would shape Greece's future, and test his worth as his father's heir. On the eve of battle, tension ran through the camp. The Athenians had fielded thousands of hoplites, their heavy infantry, while the Thebans brought their fearsome sacred band, a unit of warriors renowned across Greece for their discipline and valor. To many Greeks, this alliance represented the last stand of freedom against Macedonian domination. For Alexander, however, it was an opportunity to carve his name into history. When the armies met, Philip placed himself at the head of one wing, facing the Athenians. On the opposite side, the young Alexander commanded the Macedonian cavalry. Accounts tell us that Philip deliberately feigned retreat on his side of the line, drawing the Athenians forward and disrupting their formation. It was a classic display of Philip's cunning strategy. But on the other wing, Alexander was about to seize the moment that would define him. Charging at the head of his cavalry, Alexander led a fierce assault against the Theban sacred band. The clash was brutal. Shields locked, spears thrust, and the thunder of hooves shook the field. Despite their reputation, the sacred band could not withstand the ferocity of the Macedonian charge. Alexander broke through their lines, cutting down many of their finest warriors. His courage electrified the soldiers around him, and his decisive strike shattered the enemy's cohesion. By the end of the battle, the sacred band had been annihilated, and the coalition of Athens and Thebes lay in ruins. The victory at Chaeronea was complete. Philip had triumphed, but Alexander's role did not go unnoticed. For the first time, the Greek world saw him not just as the son of a great king, but as a warrior and commander of remarkable ability. His boldness, his speed, and his willingness to take risks earned him admiration among the Macedonians and fear among his enemies. He had proven that even at 18 he possessed the qualities of a leader destined for greatness. The aftermath of Chaeronea had consequences far beyond the battlefield. Philip now dominated Greece. He formed the League of Corinth, uniting the city-states under Macedonian hegemony, with himself as leader. His next vision was to launch a grand campaign against Persia, the mighty empire across the Aegean that had once invaded Greece under Xerxes. But while Philip prepared for this ambitious venture, Alexander's reputation within Macedonia continued to grow. Stories of his bravery spread quickly. Soldiers who had fought at Chaeronea spoke of the young prince's fearlessness in battle, his command over the companion cavalry, and the swiftness with which he struck down enemies. Among the Greeks, his name became associated with both respect and dread. Even his rivals acknowledged that Macedonia's future rested in his hands. Yet Alexander's rise as a prince was not without challenges. At Philip's court, politics were as dangerous as battle. Rival factions sought influence, and Alexander's position as heir was threatened more than once. The most serious conflict arose when Philip remarried Cleopatra Eurydice, a Macedonian noblewoman. This union jeopardized Alexander's claim to the throne, as any son born from this marriage would be a pure-blood Macedonian, unlike Alexander, whose mother Olympias came from Epirus. Tensions came to a head at a wedding banquet when one of Cleopatra's relatives toasted the hope of a legitimate Macedonian heir. Alexander, infuriated, hurled his cup and shouted an insult. Philip, drunk and enraged, drew his sword and lunged at his son. Stumbling in his attempt, Philip fell, and Alexander mocked him by saying, "Here is the man who would cross from Europe into Asia, and yet he cannot even cross from one couch to another." The confrontation was a scandal, and for a time, Alexander left Macedonia with his mother. Despite this rift, Alexander's reputation as a warrior and prince remained strong. Philip knew that his son's talent was undeniable, even if their relationship was fraught with rivalry. Over time, the two reconciled, though the tension between them never fully vanished. Alexander continued to serve his father, but deep down, he was determined to surpass him. The victory at Chaeronea had already planted in him the belief that he was destined for more than inheritance. He was meant to outshine Philip and carve his own path. In the years following Chaeronea, Alexander honed his leadership further. He acted as regent when Philip campaigned abroad, putting down revolts with decisiveness. He surrounded himself with companions who would later become his generals and closest advisors, men like Ptolemy, Hephaestion, and Perdiccas. Together, they formed the circle of loyalty that would follow Alexander across Asia in the years to come. But for now, he remained the prince, the young lion in the shadow of a powerful king. He had tasted glory on the battlefield and earned the admiration of soldiers. He had learned to navigate the dangerous politics of court, where alliances shifted like sand. And he had begun to see himself as not just Philip's heir, but as a figure with a destiny of his own. The Battle of Chaeronea was more than a military victory, it was the moment Alexander's identity as a leader crystallized. The boy who had once tamed Bucephalus was now the commander who crushed the sacred band. The Prince of Macedonia had become a warrior in the eyes of Greece. And though Philip's shadow still loomed large, The world had begun to whisper of Alexander not merely as the son of Philip, but as the young lion who would one day roar across the continents. This rise of a prince was the beginning of a legend. Chaeronea was his first great test, and he had passed it with brilliance. Yet greater challenges lay ahead: conflicts within the royal family, the sudden death of Philip, and the immense responsibility of kingship. For now, however, Alexander stood tall, sharpened by war, his ambition burning ever brighter. The young lion had shown his claws and the world had taken notice. In the summer of 336 BCE, Macedonia was at the height of its power. King Philip II had reformed the army, expanded the kingdom, and created the League of Corinth, uniting the Greek city-states under his authority. He was preparing for the greatest campaign of his life, the invasion of the Persian Empire. But fate changed everything in a single moment. At a wedding in Aegae, Philip was struck down by an assassin. The king who had built Macedonia into a superpower was gone, and his 20-year-old son Alexander suddenly found himself thrust into power. Philip's assassination remains one of history's great mysteries. Ancient writers recorded that the killer was a young bodyguard named Pausanias. He attacked Philip in public and was quickly cut down by other guards. But the question of who ordered the assassination has never been fully answered. Some said it was a personal grudge. Others suspected deeper conspiracies involving Persia, rival Macedonian nobles, or even members of Philip's own family. What mattered most, however, was that Macedonia was left without its brilliant king, and Alexander had to take his place immediately. Alexander's position was not secure at first. He was young and many nobles doubted his ability to rule. He had to act quickly to show strength. In the days following his father's death, Alexander made sure to punish those who were suspected of plotting against Philip. At the same time, he made strong gestures to win the loyalty of the army, which was the true foundation of Macedonian power. Soldiers who had marched with Philip now looked to his son to continue the mission. The army accepted Alexander as king because he had already proved himself in battle. 2 years earlier, at the Battle of Chaeronea, he had commanded the Macedonian cavalry and helped secure victory over the Greeks. The soldiers respected his courage and leadership. Now, as king, Alexander promised to continue his father's plan, the conquest of Persia. This gave the troops confidence that Philip's vision would live on. But the challenges were not only within Macedonia. News of Philip's death spread quickly across Greece. Many city-states saw this as a chance to break free from Macedonian control. Thebes, Athens, and other cities began to stir with rebellion. Alexander understood that if he lost Greece, he could not hope to rule an empire. So, instead of mourning for long, he marched south with his army to enforce Macedonian dominance. His speed and determination shocked the Greeks. Within weeks, he appeared before the walls of rebellious cities. Athens hesitated to fight directly, while Thebes resisted more strongly. But Alexander acted ruthlessly to send a message. When Thebes rose in revolt, he ordered the city destroyed. Thousands were killed and the survivors were sold into slavery. By this act, Alexander showed that rebellion would not be tolerated. At the same time, Athens and other cities quickly submitted, realizing they could not stand against his power. By crushing Thebes, Alexander secured his position as leader of the League of Corinth. This alliance of Greek states had been Philip's creation, meant to unite Greece for war against Persia. Now the League recognized Alexander as its commander. Despite his youth, he had shown the strength and resolve necessary to hold the alliance together. Within Macedonia itself, Alexander had to deal with rival claimants to the throne. Philip had other wives and other children, and some nobles believed that these family members could replace Alexander. The most dangerous of these was Amyntas, a relative with royal blood. Alexander quickly eliminated him and anyone else who might threaten his rule. In this way he secured the dynasty for himself. His mother, Olympias, played a major role during these events. Fierce and ambitious, she supported her son with all her influence. Ancient sources suggest she may have even had a hand in Philip's assassination, though this cannot be proven. What is certain is that Olympias ensured no rival branch of the royal family could challenge Alexander. Together, mother and son created a strong foundation for the new reign. Once Macedonia and Greece were secure, Alexander turned to the larger vision of empire. Philip had prepared the campaign against Persia carefully. The Macedonian army had been reorganized, supplied, and trained for the massive undertaking. Now Alexander inherited this mission. But before setting out, he had to prove his authority beyond Greece. In Thrace and Illyria to the north, tribes were restless. They believed that the death of Philip gave them a chance to throw off Macedonian rule. Alexander marched his army into their lands and crushed their resistance. These campaigns showed that Macedonia was still strong and that the young king was every bit as capable as his father. By securing the northern frontiers, Alexander ensured that no enemies would threaten his rear once he marched east. The speed and energy with which Alexander acted impressed even his critics. In a matter of months, he had gone from an uncertain young ruler to a king who dominated Greece and Macedonia completely. His decisive action against rivals, his swift campaigns against rebels, and his ruthless treatment of Thebes all made clear that he would not tolerate weakness. He was determined to continue Philip's dream of conquest, but now it would be his own. The assassination of Philip had threatened to undo everything Macedonia had built. But Alexander turned this crisis into an opportunity to prove himself. At just 20 years old, he showed the ambition, intelligence, and military skill that would later make him one of history's greatest conquerors. The crown was not inherited easily. It was seized through quick thinking, force, and determination. By the end of 336 BCE, Alexander stood firm as king of Macedonia, leader of Greece, and commander of the League of Corinth. The foundations of his empire had been secured. Ahead lay the great challenge of facing Persia, the most powerful empire of the age. But already in these first months of rule, Alexander revealed that he was no ordinary successor. He was ready to make the title of king his own, not just by birth but by action. This was the true birth of Alexander the Great, not only the son of Philip and Olympias, but a leader who, in the face of danger, proved himself worthy of the crown. Macedonia had a new king, and the world was about to witness the rise of a conqueror unlike any other. By the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander was ready to fulfill the mission that had begun with his father. Philip II had dreamed of invading Persia, and now his son would carry that plan forward. Macedonia had been secured, Greece had been forced into obedience, and the northern borders were stable. With his kingdom safe behind him, Alexander turned his eyes east. The Persian Empire was the largest and richest power in the known world. Conquering it would require boldness, discipline, and vision. At just 22 years old, Alexander set out to achieve what no Greek had ever done before. The Persian Empire stretched from Asia Minor in the west to India in the east. Its armies were vast, its resources immense, and its kings powerful. Many Greeks still remembered the wars of the past, when Persia had invaded Greece a century earlier under Xerxes and Darius. Now the tables were turned. Alexander would carry the fight across the Aegean, not simply to defend Greece but to conquer the empire that had once threatened his homeland. The Macedonian army that marched with him was the finest of its age. It numbered around 40,000 men, 30,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, supported by allies from Greece and mercenaries. The core was the Macedonian phalanx with its long sarissas, pikes twice as long as those used by other armies. Alongside them marched Hyphasis, elite infantry, and the companion cavalry, Alexander's most trusted force, where he himself fought at the front. These soldiers had trained together for years under Philip and were hardened by campaigns in Greece and the north. They were loyal, disciplined, and confident in their young king. Before crossing into Asia, Alexander made a symbolic gesture. He sailed to the ancient city of Troy, the site of Homer's epic battles. At Troy he honored the memory of Achilles, whom he considered his ancestor and role model. According to tradition he took a shield from the temple of Athena, carrying it as a link to the heroes of old. By doing this, Alexander cast himself as the new Achilles, ready to fight against a great Eastern empire just as the legendary warrior had fought before. This act inspired his men and gave his campaign the sense of destiny. The Persians, for their part, did not underestimate the threat. Though they ruled a vast empire, they knew that the Macedonian army was formidable. The satraps, or governors, of Asia Minor gathered their forces to stop Alexander before he could advance too far inland. They positioned their army on the banks of the Granicus River, in northwestern Asia Minor. Their plan was simple: block Alexander at the very start of his invasion and crush his army before it gained momentum. The Battle of the Granicus in May 334 BCE was Alexander's first major test against Persia. The Persian satraps assembled a force of around 20,000 cavalry and 20,000 infantry, including many Greek mercenaries. Their strength lay in their cavalry, which they stationed along the riverbank to prevent Alexander from crossing. The river was steep and difficult, giving them a natural advantage. The Persians believed that no army would dare charge across under such conditions. But Alexander was not a man who waited or hesitated. As soon as his army arrived, he prepared to attack. His generals advised caution: suggesting they wait until morning to cross when the sun would not be in their eyes and the river calmer. Alexander refused. He believed that hesitation would weaken the morale of his troops and embolden the Persians. Instead, he chose to attack immediately, setting the tone for his entire campaign: bold, fast, and unexpected. The Macedonian cavalry charged into the river. At the front rode Alexander himself, wearing a bright helmet with white plumes that made him stand out clearly to both his men and his enemies. The fighting was brutal. Persian cavalry met them head-on as they tried to climb the steep banks, and the Macedonian horsemen struggled to gain footing. But Alexander pushed forward, striking at the enemy leaders directly. In the chaos, he was nearly killed when a Persian noble raised his sword to strike him down. At the last moment, one of Alexander's companions, Clitus the Black, intervened and saved his king's life. The turning point came when Alexander's forces managed to establish a foothold on the opposite bank. Once across, the phalanx pressed forward with their long spears, and the companion cavalry drove deep into the Persian lines. The Persian horsemen broke under the pressure, and soon the entire army began to retreat. The Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia were left behind, surrounded and slaughtered in large numbers. Alexander spared only a few survivors, sending them back to Greece as a warning of what awaited those who fought against him. The victory at Granicus was complete. Alexander had destroyed the Persian army in Asia Minor and secured the first step of his campaign. The immediate result was the opening of Western Asia Minor to Macedonian control. City after city surrendered or switched sides, welcoming Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule. His policy was to treat those who cooperated with respect while punishing only those who resisted. This earned him support in many places and weakened Persian authority. One of Alexander's most important acts after Granicus was the handling of Greek cities under Persian control. He declared that these cities were now free, no longer under Persian tyranny. In reality, they were under Macedonian control, but Alexander cleverly used the language of Greek freedom to win support. By doing this, he presented himself not as a conqueror of Greeks but as their champion against Persia. This propaganda helped unite his forces and undermined Persian influence in the region. As he moved through Asia Minor, Alexander also secured the coastal cities. This was vital because the Persian navy was still powerful and could threaten his supply lines. By capturing ports and coastal towns, Alexander ensured that the Persian fleet would have fewer bases from which to operate. One by one, cities such as Sardis, Halicarnassus, and others fell into his hands. Some resisted fiercely, like Halicarnassus, where Persian forces put up a strong defense. But Alexander's determination eventually forced their surrender. The speed of his progress amazed both his allies and his enemies. Within a year, most of Asia Minor was firmly under Macedonian control. Persian satraps were either defeated, killed, or forced to flee deeper into the empire. The once mighty authority of the great king in these western provinces was collapsing. Alexander appointed trusted officers as governors in the conquered regions, but he often left local rulers in place if they pledged loyalty. This policy of mixing Macedonian and local leadership helped stabilize his rule. The psychological impact of the Granicus victory was enormous. Persia had been seen as almost invincible, yet Alexander had defeated their forces in his very first battle on their soil. His reputation as a daring and unstoppable commander spread quickly. For the Macedonians, the victory confirmed their faith in their young king. For the Persians, it was a warning that this was no ordinary invasion. As Alexander advanced, he also showed a keen sense of strategy. He did not rush blindly into the heart of Persia. Instead, he secured his flanks, captured cities, and established supply lines. He understood that conquering an empire of such size required careful preparation as well as bold attacks. Each victory strengthened his position and weakened his enemy's ability to respond. By late 334 BCE, Alexander had firmly established himself as the new master of Asia Minor. But this was only the beginning. Ahead lay the vast heartlands of the Persian Empire and the armies of King Darius III himself. Alexander's invasion had begun with a river crossing and a bold charge at Granicus. Now, with the first step achieved, he prepared for even greater challenges. The Persian dream was no longer just his father's vision. It was Alexander's mission. His men had seen his courage, his enemies had felt his power, and the world was beginning to recognize that a new force had risen in the west. The conquest of Persia was underway, and the young king of Macedonia would stop at nothing until the empire of the great king lay at his feet. The confrontation between Alexander of Macedon and Darius III of Persia stands as one of the greatest rivalries in the history of warfare. On one side was the youthful Macedonian king, barely in his 20s, commanding a relatively small but disciplined army. On the other side stood the Persian great king, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever seen, with resources stretching from Egypt to India. Their clash was not simply about territory, it was a struggle that would decide whether the East would dominate the West or whether the West, through Alexander, would leave its mark upon the East. When Alexander defeated the Persian satraps at the Battle of Granicus in 334 BCE, it was clear that he was not content with small victories. He intended to drive deep into Asia and challenge Darius himself. Granicus had given him control over Asia Minor, but Persia was still intact. Darius III, though relatively new on the throne, was determined to crush this invasion and defend the Achaemenid Empire. Thus began the sequence of events that would lead to the decisive encounters at Issus and Gaugamela. The road to Issus. After Granicus, Alexander moved south along the coast of Asia Minor. One by one, the coastal cities submitted or were taken. His strategy was clear. He wanted to cut off the Persian fleet from safe harbors, ensuring that the superior Persian navy could not threaten his supply lines. By taking cities such as Halicarnassus and securing the coastline, Alexander forced Persia onto the defensive. Meanwhile, Darius began raising an enormous army. Reports spread across the empire that the great king was assembling forces from every satrapy. Infantry, cavalry, archers and mercenaries were gathered in huge numbers. Persian armies had always relied on their sheer size, but Darius hoped this army would not only outnumber Alexander but also crush him decisively, sending the Greeks back across the Aegean. In 333 BCE, Darius marched westward to confront the Macedonian invader. He positioned his forces in northern Syria, near a place called Issus. However, due to maneuvering and miscommunication, the two armies ended up facing each other in an unexpected position. Instead of meeting Alexander on wide, open plains where his numbers could be used to full effect, Darius found himself trapped between the mountains and the sea, with a much narrower battlefield. This mistake would prove costly. The Battle of Issus. The Macedonian army at Issus numbered perhaps around 40,000 men, while the Persian army was much larger. Ancient sources exaggerate the numbers into the hundreds of thousands, though modern historians estimate perhaps 70,000 to 100,000. Still, Darius had the advantage of manpower, yet the terrain neutralized much of it. The battle began with the Persians launching their attack across the narrow Panaris River. Alexander, as always, led from the front. On the right wing he commanded the companion cavalry, his elite horsemen, and personally drove into the Persian left. At the same time, the Macedonian phalanx advanced in the center, locking shields and spears against the Persian infantry. Darius commanded from a royal chariot in the middle of the battlefield, surrounded by his guard. But soon the pressure on the Persian left collapsed under Alexander's assault. The companions smashed through, wheeling toward the center where Darius stood. At the sight of Alexander charging directly toward him, Darius lost his nerve. Abandoning his chariot, he fled the battlefield, leaving his vast army leaderless. The Persian lines broke. Thousands were cut down in the retreat, and the Macedonians captured immense treasure and supplies from the royal camp. More importantly, Alexander captured members of Darius' family, including his mother, wife and daughters. This was both a symbolic and political blow, showing that Darius had failed to protect even his own household. The victory at Issus gave Alexander control of the eastern Mediterranean coast. City after city, including the wealthy Phoenician ports, now opened their gates. Even Egypt would soon fall into his hands. But for Alexander, Issus was not enough. He had defeated Darius once, but the great king was still alive and Persia was still intact. Another clash was inevitable. Between Issus and Gaugamela. After Issus, Darius attempted diplomacy. He sent envoys to Alexander, offering peace, a ransom for his captured family, and large amounts of territory west of the Euphrates. Many of Alexander's officers advised him to accept the offer, arguing that the gains already achieved were enormous. But Alexander refused. He declared that as the conqueror he did not need to negotiate from a position of strength. Instead, he demanded recognition as the rightful king of Asia. The war would continue. Over the next 2 years, Alexander consolidated his hold over the Levant and Egypt. He famously visited the oracle of Ammon in the Siwa oasis, where he was greeted as the son of Zeus Ammon. This divine recognition reinforced his belief that his conquest of Persia was destiny. Meanwhile, Darius rebuilt his forces. Learning from the mistakes of Issus, he prepared for a battle on terrain of his own choosing. He selected the plains near Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, a vast, open space where his superior numbers, especially cavalry, could maneuver freely. The Battle of Gaugamela. The two armies met in 331 BCE. Once again, Persian numbers dwarfed those of the Macedonians. Ancient sources speak of hundreds of thousands of Persian troops, though modern estimates suggest something closer to 100,000 to 120,000. Darius had assembled cavalry from across his empire, scythe chariots designed to break infantry formations, and even war elephants. Alexander's force, by contrast, was perhaps 47,000 men. Yet his troops were veterans, disciplined and confident in their commander. On the morning of the battle, Alexander held a council of war. His officers urged caution, but he declared his intention to fight. He formed his army in a deep double line to guard against encirclement, with the phalanx in the center and cavalry on the flanks. Alexander himself again took command of the right wing with the companions. The battle began with the Persians sending in their chariots, but Alexander's troops opened lanes, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through before cutting down the drivers. The Macedonian phalanx held firm against waves of Persian infantry, while on the left wing, Parmenians struggled under heavy pressure from Persian cavalry. Alexander waited for the right moment. Then, leading his companions, he launched a decisive charge directly toward the Persian center. The wedge formation of the Macedonian cavalry drove deep into the Persian line, heading straight for Darius. Once again the great king lost his nerve. As Alexander approached, Darius turned his chariot and fled the field. The Persian army collapsed. Though parts of it continued to resist, the loss of leadership was fatal. Thousands were killed in the pursuit, and the battlefield was littered with Persian dead. Darius himself escaped, but his authority was shattered. The empire's heartland lay open to Alexander. Aftermath and significance. The victory at Gaugamela was not just another battle, it was the decisive turning point of the war. Alexander marched into Babylon, then Susa, and finally Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian kings. The treasures of the Achaemenid dynasty fell into his hands, and with them the wealth to finance further campaigns. For Persia, Gaugamela marked the effective end of the empire. Darius fled east, attempting to rally support, but many satraps abandoned him, turning instead to Alexander. Eventually, Darius would be betrayed and killed by his own men, leaving Alexander the undisputed master of Asia. The clashes at Issus and Gaugamela revealed not only the weakness of Persia but also the brilliance of Alexander. He consistently turned disadvantages into advantages, using terrain, timing, and personal leadership to overcome vastly larger forces. His refusal to negotiate after Issus showed his ambition. Nothing short of the entire Persian Empire would satisfy him. For the wider world, these battles symbolized a shift in power. The great empire of the East, which had dominated for centuries, fell before the rising strength of the West under Macedon. Yet Alexander's conquests also fused the two worlds together, spreading Greek culture into Asia while adopting elements of Persian administration and custom. The rivalry between Alexander and Darius was unequal in outcome but monumental in impact. Darius may have commanded the largest empire, but Alexander commanded loyalty, discipline, and daring. At Issus he showed that courage and leadership could overcome numbers. At Gaugamela, he demonstrated that vision and tactical genius could change the course of history. By the end of these battles, Alexander was not just king of Macedon. He was the ruler of Asia, heir to both Greece and Persia, and on his way to becoming one of history's most legendary conquerors. After defeating Darius III at Issus, Alexander of Macedon turned his gaze to the south. The Persian Empire still held Egypt, but its control was weak. For centuries, Egypt had been ruled by foreign powers, first by Assyrians then Persians. The Egyptians resented Persian governors, who often disrespected their traditions and temples. To the Egyptian people, Alexander's arrival was not an invasion but a liberation. In 332 BCE, Alexander marched his army through Phoenicia and into Gaza. Gaza resisted but was captured after a long siege. With the Mediterranean coast secured, Alexander continued into Egypt. Unlike in Tyre or Gaza, there was no massive resistance in the Nile Valley. The Egyptians had grown weary of Persian control. They saw in Alexander a chance for new leadership. When he entered Memphis, crowds welcomed him as a deliverer. Priests hailed him as the new pharaoh, the living son of the gods. Alexander respected Egyptian religion. He visited temples, made offerings, and showed honor to the local gods. This was very different from Persian satraps, who had sometimes looted temples. By presenting himself not only as a conqueror but as a worshipper of Egyptian deities, Alexander gained the support of the priesthood, the class that held great influence in Egypt. In Memphis, a great ceremony was held. Alexander was crowned pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt. He wore the double crown, a symbol of unity over the Nile Valley. For the Egyptians, he became son of Ammonius, a divine ruler chosen by the gods. This title was important because it legitimized him not just as a foreign conqueror but as the rightful king in Egyptian eyes. But Alexander wanted more than just titles. He understood Egypt's strategic importance. The Nile Delta sat at the crossroads of trade routes linking Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Near East. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled one of the wealthiest regions of the ancient world. Alexander's vision was not only military but also economic. During his time in Egypt, Alexander made one of his most enduring decisions: the founding of Alexandria. Traveling to the Mediterranean coast, he selected a site west of the Nile Delta, near the small village of Rhakotis. The location was perfect. To the north lay the sea, giving access to trade with Greece and beyond. To the south stretched the Nile, the lifeline of Egypt. To the west lay routes toward Libya, and to the east, easy access to the Red Sea through future canals. According to later accounts, Alexander personally drew the plan of the new city. The design followed a grid pattern, a hallmark of Greek urban planning. Wide streets would cross at right angles. At the center, a great marketplace would rise, surrounded by temples and administrative buildings. There would be space for docks, shipyards, and storage houses. Alexander wanted Alexandria to be a city of both commerce and culture. Local legend tells that when Alexander marked out the city's boundaries with flour, birds came and ate it. Some saw this as a bad omen, but Alexander declared it a sign of prosperity, that the city would feed nations. Whatever the truth, Alexandria quickly grew into a dream that would outlast him. From Alexandria, Alexander traveled to the western desert. His destination was the Siwa oasis, home to the oracle of Ammonius. This was no ordinary visit. Greek tradition held that great leaders often sought divine approval. For Alexander, it was more than ritual. He wanted confirmation of his destiny. The journey to Siwa was long and harsh. His army crossed barren desert, where shifting sands and heat tested endurance. Ancient writers later described miraculous events, rains that saved the men, birds that guided their way. Whether true or not, the story reinforced the idea that Alexander was favored by the gods. At the temple of Ammonius in Siwa, Alexander entered the sanctuary. Only the priests and Alexander knew what was said inside. Rumors spread afterward. Some claimed the oracle hailed him as son of Zeus Ammon. Others said he was told he would conquer the world. Alexander himself was careful with his words, but he began to act with greater confidence in his divine mission. This moment shaped his image. Among the Greeks he was king. Among the Macedonians he was commander. Among the Egyptians he was pharaoh, child of the sun god. Now, with the oracle's words, he was also seen as a son of Zeus. Whether through belief or strategy, Alexander used this to strengthen his authority. Soldiers followed him not only as a general but as someone touched by the divine. After Siwa, Alexander returned to Memphis. He organized Egypt into a province of his growing empire but ruled with a lighter hand. He appointed trusted officials, both Greek and Egyptian. Instead of oppressing temples, he supported them. By leaving behind a stable system of governance, he ensured Egypt would serve as a loyal base for his campaigns further east. The foundation of Alexandria marked the beginning of a new era. Over time, it would become the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean. The Great Library of Alexandria, though built after his death, was part of this legacy. Scholars, scientists, and philosophers from Greece, Egypt, and beyond gathered there. The city blended Greek and Egyptian culture, becoming a model of Hellenistic civilization. For Alexander, Egypt was both a conquest and a statement. By taking the double crown, visiting Siwa, and founding Alexandria, he declared himself not just a Greek king but a ruler of the ancient world. Unlike the Persians who had failed to win true Egyptian loyalty, Alexander became a pharaoh in spirit as well as name. When he left Egypt in 331 BCE, he did so with little resistance behind him. His rear was secure. His army was rested. His treasury was enriched. Ahead lay the heart of the Persian Empire, where Darius waited with massive armies. But Alexander marched knowing he had secured the Nile, and with it, the respect of one of the world's oldest civilizations. The story of Alexander in Egypt is more than a tale of conquest. It is about vision. Many conquerors had passed through Egypt, but Alexander left behind something permanent. He united Greek and Egyptian traditions. He created a city that would shape history for centuries. And he tied his own image to both pharaohs and gods, raising himself above ordinary kings. By the time Alexander left the land of the Nile, he was no longer just a Macedonian king leading an army. He was pharaoh of two lands, son of Zeus Ammon, and the founder of a city that would shine long after his empire was gone. His march toward Persia would soon bring even greater battles, but Egypt remained the place where he turned from conqueror into legend. After securing Egypt, Alexander turned his full attention back to Persia. Darius III still ruled vast lands, but the defeats at Issus and the loss of Egypt had shaken Persian authority. Alexander knew that the final blow must be delivered deep inside Persia itself. His dream was not only to defeat Darius but to destroy the Persian Empire as a political power and to replace it with his own rule. In 331 BCE, Alexander led his army out of Egypt and marched toward Mesopotamia. The route took him through Phoenicia and Syria again. He made sure all cities along the way remained loyal and left garrisons to secure them. This was important because his supply lines stretched far back to Macedonia. Any rebellion could cut his communications. Darius, determined to stop Alexander once and for all, gathered a massive army. Ancient accounts speak of hundreds of thousands, though modern estimates suggest a smaller but still huge force. Soldiers came from every corner of the Persian Empire. Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Scythians, Bactrians, and even Indian war elephants. Darius hoped sheer numbers would crush Alexander's smaller but disciplined Macedonian army. The two forces met at Gaugamela, near modern-day Mosul in Iraq. Darius chose a wide, open plain where his cavalry and chariots could maneuver freely. He even had the ground leveled to make it easier for his side chariots to charge. Darius believed he had every advantage. Alexander, however, studied the battlefield carefully. On October 1, 331 BCE, the Battle of Gaugamela began. Alexander positioned his phalanx at the center, cavalry on the wings and reserves behind. Darius placed himself in the center of his army as a great king should, with his elite guard. The Persians attacked first, sending their cavalry in waves. Alexander's right flank bent under pressure, but this was part of his plan. He led his companion cavalry in a daring charge, aiming directly at Darius himself. The charge broke through the Persian lines and once again Darius panicked. He fled the field, leaving his vast army leaderless. The Persian troops, seeing their king run, began to collapse. Some fought bravely, but without direction they were slaughtered. The Macedonian phalanx advanced relentlessly. By the end of the day, the Persian army was shattered. Alexander had won his most decisive victory. After Gaugamela, the Persian Empire was finished as a military power. Darius fled east with a small guard, but most cities opened their gates to Alexander. Babylon, one of the greatest cities of the world, surrendered without resistance. The priests and nobles welcomed Alexander, who treated them with respect. He restored temples and ordered his men not to loot. This policy won him support and helped stabilize his conquests. From Babylon, Alexander marched to Susa, another royal city. Here he captured enormous treasure, said to be thousands of tons of gold and silver. This wealth allowed him to pay his soldiers and finance further campaigns. Susa also held the royal archives and treasures of the Achaemenid dynasty, symbols of imperial power. By taking them, Alexander proclaimed himself the new great king. But Alexander wanted more. He advanced to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia. Persepolis was not just a city but a symbol of Persian greatness. Built by Darius I and Xerxes, it housed magnificent palaces, halls, and the treasures of centuries. Alexander's army reached the city in early 330 BCE. The Persian guards resisted but were quickly defeated. When Alexander entered Persepolis, he allowed his men to plunder. 4 days, Macedonian soldiers looted its treasures. Ancient accounts say that thousands of mules and camels were needed to carry away the wealth. It was the richest prize of Alexander's career. Then came one of the most controversial acts of his life. At a banquet, possibly influenced by wine and the encouragement of companions, Alexander ordered Persepolis to be burned. Some sources say it was revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece 150 years earlier, when Xerxes burned Athens. Others claim it was an accident or a drunken impulse. Whatever the reason, the palaces of Persepolis went up in flames. The destruction was so complete that even today, ruins bear marks of fire. The burning shocked many, including Alexander himself when he sobered. Later he regretted it, realizing he had destroyed one of the greatest monuments of ancient civilization. But by then the deed was done. Persepolis, the heart of Persian culture, was gone. Symbolically, it marked the end of the Achaemenid Empire. Meanwhile, Darius III was still alive, retreating into the eastern provinces. Alexander pursued him relentlessly, determined to capture him alive. For Alexander, it was not enough to burn cities and seize treasures. He wanted to stand as the legitimate ruler, and for that he needed Darius, either as a prisoner or as proof of his supremacy. The chase continued across Media and Parthia. Darius's support dwindled. Many satraps and nobles abandoned him, recognizing Alexander as the stronger master. Eventually, Darius was betrayed by his own satrap, Bessus, who hoped to claim the throne for himself. In 330 BCE, Darius was captured and fatally wounded by his former allies. When Alexander reached the scene, he found Darius dead. According to tradition, he covered the body with his own cloak and mourned. He ordered a royal funeral in honor of the fallen king, showing respect to his former enemy. By doing so, he sent a message: he was not just a conqueror but the rightful successor to the Persian throne. With Darius gone, Alexander declared himself King of Kings, adopting the Persian royal title. He began to wear Persian robes at times and demanded proskynesis, the Persian act of bowing to the king. This shocked many Macedonians who saw it as a betrayal of their traditions. Tension grew between Alexander and some of his companions, but Alexander believed blending Greek and Persian customs was necessary to rule such a vast empire. From this point, Alexander was not only king of Macedon but Shahenshah, the Persian king of kings. He controlled lands from the Aegean Sea to the Persian Gulf, from Egypt to Central Asia. No one before him had united so much territory under a single rule. The fall of Persepolis and the death of Darius marked the end of the Persian Empire that had lasted for more than 2 centuries. It was one of the greatest empires of the ancient world, and now it was gone, absorbed into Alexander's dominion. The Greeks who once feared Persia as an unstoppable giant now saw a Macedonian king sitting on the Persian throne. But for Alexander, conquest was not enough. He was driven by ambition, by a desire to go further east. Even as he claimed the Persian crown, he prepared to march toward new lands, chasing glory beyond the horizon. The empire of Darius was gone, but Alexander's journey was far from over. With Darius III dead and the Persian Empire under his control, Alexander could have returned to Macedonia as the greatest conqueror of his age. He had wealth beyond imagination, power over vast lands and the title of King of Kings. But Alexander was not content. His ambition pushed him further east, into lands unknown to the Greeks and Macedonians. His next destination was India, a region described in myths and traveler accounts as wealthy, mysterious, and filled with powerful rulers. In 327 BCE, Alexander gathered his army and began his march eastward. The route took him through the rugged mountains of modern Afghanistan and into the Punjab region of northwestern India. This was no easy journey. The terrain was harsh, food was scarce, and resistance came from local tribes. Alexander had to fight a series of difficult campaigns just to secure his path. His men were tired after years of war, but Alexander's energy never faded. He personally led assaults, climbed mountains, and shared the hardships of his soldiers. The most famous of these tribal campaigns was against the Aspagioi and the Assacenoi. They resisted fiercely, defending their mountain fortresses with determination. Alexander had to storm one stronghold after another. At Massaga, the Assacenoi defended their city bravely. When Alexander finally captured it, the casualties were heavy on both sides. These brutal campaigns demonstrated Alexander's persistence but also showed the growing fatigue of his army. By the spring of 326 BCE, Alexander crossed the Indus River, entering India proper. There he met King Porus, ruler of the region between the Jhelum and Chenab rivers. Porus was no minor chieftain. He commanded a strong army, including the fearsome Indian war elephants. The clash between Alexander and Porus would become legendary. The two armies met at the Battle of the Hydaspes River in May 326 BCE. The setting was difficult. The river was swollen with monsoon rains, and Porus positioned his forces on the far bank, ready to crush any crossing. Alexander studied the situation carefully. He realized a direct attack would fail. Instead, he devised a clever strategy. One night, Alexander secretly marched part of his army upstream to a ford. He crossed the river in the dark and emerged on the opposite bank at dawn. Porus, surprised by this maneuver, quickly moved to face Alexander. The battle was fierce. Porus's army included thousands of infantry, cavalry, and nearly 200 war elephants. The elephants terrified the Macedonian horses, who had never faced such beasts before. But Alexander adapted. He ordered his archers and light infantry to target the elephants, wounding and confusing them. The Macedonian phalanx held firm, pressing forward against Porus's infantry. Meanwhile, Alexander led his cavalry in repeated charges, striking the flanks of Porus's army. The elephants, though powerful, eventually panicked under the rain of arrows and the pressure of battle. Some rampaged through their own lines, causing chaos. Despite their courage, Porus's troops could not withstand Alexander's disciplined tactics. After hours of fighting, Porus was wounded and surrounded. Yet he refused to surrender until Alexander himself approached. When brought before the Macedonian king, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. Porus famously replied, "Like a king." Impressed by his bravery, Alexander restored Porus to his throne and even gave him more territory. This act showed Alexander's policy of respecting strong rulers who earned his admiration. The Battle of the Hydaspes was one of Alexander's hardest fights. His army faced unfamiliar weapons, difficult terrain, and a determined opponent. The victory secured his control over the Punjab, but it also revealed the limits of conquest. After the battle, Alexander continued deeper into India. He founded cities, one of them named Nicaea, Victory, near the battlefield, and another called Bucephala, in honor of his beloved horse Bucephalus, who died after the battle. Bucephalus had carried Alexander through countless wars, and his loss deeply affected him. The founding of Bucephala showed Alexander's personal attachment to his companions, whether human or animal. As Alexander pushed further east, he encountered more kingdoms. Some submitted peacefully, offering tribute and alliance. Others resisted but were quickly subdued. Alexander's goal was to reach the great Ganges River, described in stories as flowing through lands of immense wealth and vast armies. But his soldiers had reached their breaking point. They had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and endured extreme hardships. At the Hyphasis River, the modern Bios, the army mutinied. They refused to go any further. Reports suggested that beyond the Ganges lay armies larger than any they had faced, with thousands of elephants. The men, exhausted and longing for home, demanded to return. Alexander was furious. He tried to inspire them with speeches, reminding them of their victories and the glory still to be won. But the soldiers stood firm. For the first time, Alexander had to yield. He agreed to turn back. To mark the spot, he built 12 massive altars on the banks of the Hyphasis, dedicated to the gods as a symbol of the farthest point of his conquest. The retreat was not easy. Instead of returning by the same route, Alexander decided to explore new lands. He led part of his army through the harsh Gedrosian desert, one of the most difficult marches in history. Thousands perished from heat, thirst, and exhaustion. Some historians believe Alexander deliberately chose this dangerous route to show that he could succeed where others would fail. But the cost was heavy and morale suffered. At the same time, another part of his army traveled by sea under Admiral Nearchus, exploring the coastline of the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. This showed Alexander's vision not only as a conqueror but also as an explorer, opening new routes for trade and communication. Despite the hardships, Alexander maintained control. His charisma, determination, and leadership kept the army together, even in the face of death and despair. By the time they returned to Persia in 324 BCE, the soldiers had marched farther than any army before them, carving an empire that stretched from Greece to India. The Indian campaign revealed both Alexander's brilliance and his limits. He proved he could defeat even unfamiliar enemies with creativity and courage. He showed respect to strong rulers like Porus, earning loyalty instead of rebellion. But the refusal of his men to go further marked the first true boundary of his ambition. Even Alexander could not conquer the will of his own army. The march into India also left a lasting impact. Greek culture mixed with Indian traditions, as cities founded by Alexander became centers of exchange. Stories of Porus and the elephants fascinated Greek writers. Trade routes opened between the two worlds, linking civilizations more closely than ever before. For Alexander, however, India was not the end. He still dreamed of more conquests, Arabia, perhaps even lands beyond. But the Indian campaign was the farthest he would ever reach. It was truly the edge of his world, a place where ambition met resistance, where glory met exhaustion, and where a conqueror realized that even he had limits. By 326 BCE, Alexander had carried his banners farther than any Greek or Macedonian could have imagined. From the Aegean to the Indus, he had swept away empires, defeated kings, and founded cities. The victory over Porus at the Battle of Hydaspes stood as one of his most difficult yet most celebrated triumphs. But though the battle was won, it marked a turning point in his career. His army, worn thin by years of campaigning, had reached the edge not only of the known world but also of their endurance. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River, also known as the Bios, would expose the limits of both Alexander's ambition and his soldiers' loyalty. After the Hydaspes victory, Alexander sought to march further east. His eyes were fixed on the Ganges River and the rich kingdoms of the Gangetic Plain. Reports from local rulers and scouts painted a picture of fertile lands, immense wealth, and armies larger than anything yet encountered. These Indian kingdoms were said to field tens of thousands of infantry, powerful cavalry, and, most daunting of all, thousands of war elephants. To Alexander, this was not a deterrent but a challenge. He had faced the great king of Persia and triumphed. Now he dreamed of conquering the lands beyond the Ganges, perhaps even reaching the mythical ocean at the world's edge. The army, however, saw things differently. For nearly 8 years they had been constantly on campaign. They had marched across scorching deserts, through snowy mountain passes and into tropical jungles. They had fought countless battles and sieges, often against enemies who outnumbered them. Many veterans had left their families behind in Macedon and Greece, never knowing if they would return. Now, deep in India, thousands of miles from home, fatigue overwhelmed them. The journey itself had grown more punishing. Monsoon rains drenched the soldiers, flooding the rivers and turning the ground into mud. Food supplies became uncertain as local harvests were consumed or destroyed by armies moving through. Diseases spread in the damp climate, sapping the health of men and animals alike. Even Alexander's closest officers could see the exhaustion etched on the faces of their troops. Yet Alexander refused to yield. He called councils, arguing passionately that the army had always triumphed against impossible odds. He reminded them of their victories at Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, and Hydaspes. He insisted that glory lay not in turning back but in pushing forward, to conquer lands no Greek had ever seen. He envisioned himself not merely as king of Macedon or Persia but as master of the entire world. To stop now, he argued, would tarnish their achievements and betray the destiny of their mission. But his words no longer carried the same effect. The soldiers, though still loyal to him as a leader, could not ignore their own exhaustion. Murmurs spread through the camps. Some argued that they had already achieved more than any army in history. Others pointed to omens and the will of the gods, saying that it was time to return home. Many simply longed to see their families again, to enjoy the wealth they had gained, and to live out their lives in peace. The decisive moment came at the Hyphasis River, the modern Bios. Alexander summoned his troops, hoping to inspire them with one last speech. Standing before his weary men, he spoke of the great prizes that lay ahead, of rivers yet to be crossed and kingdoms yet to fall. He promised them eternal glory if they would follow him to the Ganges and beyond. But when he finished, the silence was heavy. Then slowly the soldiers raised their voices, not in cheers but in refusal. They would go no further. They demanded to turn back. Their spokesman, Caenus, one of Alexander's loyal generals, gave words to their feelings. He reminded Alexander that the men had followed him faithfully for years, through every danger. But now he said they were at their limit. They wished to return to their homes and families, to enjoy the rewards of their labors. Forcing them onward would risk rebellion. Alexander was furious. He withdrew to his tent, refusing to eat or speak for days. His pride had been wounded. Never before had his army disobeyed him. He believed that destiny itself was slipping from his grasp. To him, turning back meant accepting that there were boundaries he could not cross. His ambition, so long unchecked, met its first immovable obstacle, not an enemy army but the will of his own men. Eventually, Alexander accepted reality. He emerged from his tent and announced that they would turn back. But he would not let the moment pass without leaving his mark. On the banks of the Hyphasis, he ordered the construction of 12 massive altars, each dedicated to a different Olympian god. These monuments were built on a colossal scale, far larger than those usually erected for sacrifices. They were meant to symbolize the furthest reach of his conquests, the point at which Alexander had come to the edge of the known world. For Alexander, the altars were a compromise. He could not march forward, but he would ensure that history remembered this place as the boundary of his empire. Future generations would know that he had reached farther than any king before him. The decision to turn back had practical benefits. Continuing into the Gangetic Plain would have stretched supply lines beyond endurance. The swollen rivers, the vast enemy armies, and the monsoon conditions would have made further conquest uncertain. Alexander's officers likely understood this, even if he himself did not wish to admit it. In a sense, the mutiny saved his army from destruction. Yet the retreat was not without cost. The men who had forced Alexander's hand also feared his anger. They worried he might punish them later, or that he would never forgive their defiance. But Alexander did not seek revenge. He still needed his army loyal for the long journey home. Instead, he focused on planning the return, which would itself be filled with hardship and danger. The mutiny at the Hyphasis was more than a moment of refusal. It was a turning point in Alexander's career. It marked the first and only time his men openly resisted him. It showed that even the greatest conqueror depended on the will of those he led. It also revealed the tension between Alexander's boundless ambition and the human limits of endurance. For the soldiers, the mutiny was an act of survival. They had given years of their lives to the campaign, facing battles and hardships that seemed endless. By standing together, they forced even Alexander to acknowledge their needs. In a sense, it was a reminder that his empire was built not only on his vision but on their sweat, blood, and loyalty. As the army prepared to march westward, the atmosphere was heavy with mixed emotions. Alexander's dreams of conquering the world had been checked, but his men now had the promise of seeing their homes again. The altars at the Hyphasis stood as silent witnesses to both the greatness and the limits of his ambition. This moment shaped Alexander's legacy. Though he had conquered the largest empire the world had seen, he had been stopped not by enemies but by the exhaustion of his own army. The mutiny showed that even the mightiest rulers could not escape the constraints of human endurance. Glory had its limits, and at the Hyphasis, Alexander had found them. After the mutiny at the Hyphasis, Alexander's eastward march came to an end. His dream of reaching the Ganges and the ocean beyond was broken, but his will to shape destiny remained unshaken. He had promised his men that they would return, but his idea of return was far from simple. Instead of retracing their steps directly back to Persia, Alexander envisioned a grand march that would allow him to subdue more lands, secure new routes, and test the endurance of his empire. What followed was one of the most brutal and costly journeys of his career, the long return westward filled with battles, betrayals, and the deadly crossing of the Gedrosian Desert. The army set out from the banks of the Hyphasis in late 326 BCE. Alexander divided his forces for the march. Part of the army was sent with Nearchus, one of his trusted commanders, to explore and sail along the coast by sea. Alexander himself led the main body through the interior. He wanted not only to return to Persia but also to punish rebellious tribes along the way and to establish control over the regions they had conquered. To Alexander, the return was not retreat but another campaign of conquest. The first leg of the march was difficult but manageable. The army fought skirmishes against tribes resisting Macedonian rule, and Alexander used his customary ruthlessness to enforce submission. Cities that opposed him were stormed and destroyed, those that surrendered were spared. The purpose was clear. Even as he turned back, Alexander would leave behind no doubt about his authority. But the greatest trial awaited them when Alexander chose to lead his men through the Gedrosian Desert, in present-day southern Iran. The desert was notorious even in ancient times for its desolation. Vast stretches of sand, blistering heat, and scarce water made it one of the harshest environments in the known world. Local guides warned him against it, but Alexander was determined. Some historians suggest he chose this route deliberately, seeking to outdo Cyrus the Great of Persia, whose army had once perished there. If Alexander could lead his men across the same wasteland and survive, it would add to his legend. The march through Gidrosia became a nightmare. The scorching sun beat down relentlessly, and the sand seemed endless. Water was almost impossible to find, and when it was discovered, it was often brackish or insufficient for the army's needs. Men and animals collapsed from thirst and exhaustion. Supplies quickly ran out, forcing soldiers to slaughter pack animals for food. Many died along the way, their bodies left behind in the shifting sands. Alexander himself shared in the suffering, refusing to drink water when his soldiers could not. One story, preserved in ancient sources, tells of soldiers finding a small helmet full of water and offering it to Alexander. He poured it out onto the ground rather than drink alone, showing that he would endure the same hardships as his men. The gesture inspired loyalty but did little to ease the desperation of the march. By the time the army emerged from the Gidrosian desert, thousands had perished. It was one of the costliest episodes of the entire campaign. While Alexander's main force suffered in the desert, his naval expedition under Nearchus faced its own challenges. Sailing along the unfamiliar and often dangerous coastline of the Arabian Sea, the fleet battled storms, shortages of supplies, and hostile local tribes. Yet Nearchus succeeded in navigating the route, proving that the seas could be used to link India with the Persian Gulf. This discovery would later play a crucial role in Alexander's vision of trade and communication across his empire. When Alexander reunited with his forces, the mood was mixed. On the one hand, they had survived the worst, emerging from the desert as living proof of their endurance. On the other, the cost in lives had been staggering. Many soldiers felt anger that Alexander had chosen such a deadly route. For them, it seemed less like strategy and more like reckless pride. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, though open defiance did not reappear. By 325 BCE, the army was moving back into familiar Persian territory. But the long absence of Alexander had shaken the stability of his empire. During his years of campaigning in the east, satraps and governors had ruled in his name. Some had governed responsibly, but others had grown corrupt, abusing power, exploiting local populations, and enriching themselves. News of these abuses reached Alexander as he returned. His response was swift and brutal. In provinces from Persia to Media, he launched a series of purges. Satraps accused of corruption were executed. Officers suspected of treachery were replaced. One of the most dramatic examples was the execution of Cleander, a commander left behind in Media, who was accused of plundering temples and oppressing subjects. Alexander ordered him put to death, sending a clear message that misrule would not be tolerated. This purge served two purposes. It restored order in the empire and reassured subject peoples that Alexander was still in control. At the same time, it reminded his generals that loyalty was expected not only on the battlefield but also in administration. Yet these executions also sowed fear and distrust among his commanders. Many began to wonder how long they themselves would survive the king's scrutiny. The return march also revealed cracks in the unity of Alexander's army. By now, his forces included not only Macedonians and Greeks but also Persians, Bactrians, Indians, and soldiers from many other lands. Alexander had begun to promote the idea of fusing Greek and Persian cultures, encouraging intermarriage, adopting Persian dress and customs, and training Persian youths in Macedonian military methods. To him, this was a way of binding the empire together into a single whole. But many Macedonians resisted these changes. They saw themselves as conquerors, not equals with the peoples they had subdued. Resentment grew, especially when Alexander elevated Persians to positions of authority or formed new units composed of local troops. Tensions between the old Macedonian veterans and the new recruits from the east created divisions within the army. In some instances, these tensions boiled over into open conflict. When Alexander attempted to integrate large numbers of Persian soldiers into his ranks, many Macedonians felt their privileged position slipping away. The most famous incident was the so-called mutiny at Opis, in 324 BCE. Here, Macedonian veterans demanded to be sent home, complaining that they were being replaced by Persians. Alexander reacted with fury, ordering the ringleaders executed. But afterward, he softened his stance, publicly reconciling with his men in an emotional ceremony. The episode revealed both the fragility of loyalty and Alexander's skill in mending rifts when necessary. As the army drew closer to Babylon, Alexander's chosen capital, the strain of years of war was evident. The empire stretched from Greece to India, but it was held together largely by his personal authority. Many of his generals who had followed him since the beginning now looked toward the future. Some wondered what would happen once Alexander was gone. Others began to form rivalries and ambitions of their own, laying the seeds for the conflicts that would erupt after his death. In Babylon, preparations were underway to welcome the king. The city, with its monumental walls and palaces, symbolized the center of his empire. Here Alexander planned to reorganize his realm, launch new campaigns, and cement his legacy. But beneath the surface, the empire he had built was already unstable. The purges had removed corrupt officials but also bred resentment. The policy of cultural fusion inspired some but alienated many. And though the army still obeyed him, the mutiny at the Hyphasis and the grievances during the return showed that their loyalty had limits. The return to Babylon was thus not a triumphant homecoming but a mixture of glory and unease. Alexander had survived the desert, punished rebellious governors and restored discipline. Yet the hardships of the journey and the tensions among his men made clear that his empire was fragile. The generals who had once been united in conquest were beginning to look like rivals in waiting. For Alexander, however, Babylon was not the end but the beginning of another chapter. He envisioned new campaigns to Arabia and perhaps beyond, to explore and conquer yet more of the world. But for his weary army and restless generals, Babylon was a place where questions of loyalty, ambition, and survival would come to the forefront. The long return from India had revealed much: the limits of endurance, the dangers of pride, and the cracks forming in the empire. The Gedrosian desert had taken thousands of lives, the purges had shaken trust, and the tensions between Macedonians and Persians had exposed deep divisions. As Alexander entered Babylon, the stage was set for both his grandest ambitions and the struggles that would follow his sudden death. The world awaited him in Babylon, but so too did rebellion, suspicion, and fate. Alexander the Great had reached the height of his power. By 323 BCE, he was the ruler of an empire that stretched from Greece to India. He had defeated kings, destroyed dynasties, and created new cities. He had been hailed as Pharaoh in Egypt and as Shahanshah in Persia. His soldiers called him invincible. Many people believed he was more than human. Some called him the son of Zeus, others a god walking on earth. But at the age of 32, the man who had conquered half the world would face his greatest enemy, death. Alexander returned to Babylon after his long campaigns. The city was alive with celebrations. Riches from across the empire poured into his palace. Diplomats from Greece, Persia, India, and beyond came to bow before him. He began planning new conquests. He wanted to march west and invade Arabia. He dreamed of sailing further and exploring the seas beyond the known world. For Alexander, there was always another horizon to chase. But Babylon also carried shadows. The city was full of omens. The Chaldean priests, skilled in astrology, warned Alexander that entering Babylon would bring him danger. They begged him not to step through its gates. Alexander laughed off their warnings. He said that no city and no fate could scare him. He had faced death many times before. Why should he fear now? Yet unease spread among his men. They saw this defiance as arrogance. Inside Babylon, the king held feasts with his companions. He drank heavily as he often did. Ancient sources describe one particular banquet where Alexander drank a great bowl of unmixed wine in honor of Heracles. Soon after, he felt a sharp pain in his side. He collapsed in agony and had to be carried to his bed. At first, his friends thought it was nothing serious. Alexander had fallen ill before and always recovered. But this time the sickness grew worse with each passing day. Rumors began to spread. Some whispered that Alexander had been poisoned. Others claimed the gods had struck him down for his pride. His rivals at court, including some of his generals, were suspected. One story says that Antipater, the regent of Macedonia, sent poison through his son Cassander. Another story blames jealous companions who feared Alexander's next campaigns. But historians disagree. Many believe he was not poisoned but died from natural causes, perhaps malaria, typhoid, or another fever common in Mesopotamia. For days, Alexander's condition worsened. He lost the strength to walk or speak clearly. His soldiers gathered outside the palace, desperate to see him. They demanded proof that their king was still alive. The generals allowed the troops to march past his bed. One by one, thousands of soldiers filed through the chamber. They saw their great commander lying silent, too weak to rise, but raising his hand in recognition. Many wept, believing they were seeing him for the last time. Even on his deathbed, Alexander gave instructions. He handed his signet ring to Perdiccas, one of his trusted commanders. This act was seen as a sign that Perdiccas should lead after him. But when asked directly who should inherit the empire, Alexander gave a cryptic answer: to the strongest. Those words would plunge his empire into years of bloodshed and civil war. On the 10th or 11th day of his illness, Alexander slipped into unconsciousness. His companions gathered around him, unsure if he could still hear them. Some sources claim he whispered prayers to Zeus and the gods. Others say he remained silent, refusing to show weakness even at the end. Finally, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Alexander the Great died. The date was June 10 or 11, 323 BCE. He was just 32 years old. The news spread like wildfire. Across the empire, people refused to believe it. How could a man who had never lost a battle be defeated by death? In Egypt, priests called him immortal. In Greece, poets declared that only Zeus himself had called his son back to Olympus. For his soldiers, it was unthinkable. Some believed he would rise again. Others feared the empire would crumble without his guiding hand. The problem of succession soon tore the empire apart. Alexander had left no clear heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant with a child, but the baby had not yet been born. His half-brother Aristeus was alive but mentally unfit to rule. This left the generals, known as the Diadochi, to fight among themselves. Perdiccas tried to hold the empire together. But soon Cassander, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Antigonus, and others turned on each other. The wars of the successors lasted for decades, carving Alexander's empire into pieces. Meanwhile, Alexander's body became the center of controversy. At first, it was meant to be buried in Macedonia, in the royal tombs of Aegae. But Ptolemy, one of his generals, hijacked the funeral procession. He took the body to Egypt, believing that whoever controlled Alexander's remains would hold great power. The body was placed in Memphis and later moved to Alexandria, the city Alexander himself had founded. There it became a sacred relic. For centuries, visitors including Roman emperors traveled to see it. Eventually, the tomb disappeared from history, and its location remains one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. Alexander's death raised questions that have never been fully answered. Was he poisoned by rivals? Was it disease? Did his own lifestyle, his heavy drinking, his wounds from countless battles, his exhaustion, finally catch up with him? Each theory has its supporters. Some modern historians suggest West Nile virus or typhoid. Others say it could have been autoimmune disease. But none of these answers remove the mystery. Perhaps the truth was lost forever in Babylon. What is certain is that his death marked the end of an era. The dream of one united empire stretching across continents died with him. The unity he forced through conquest could not survive without his leadership. Yet his legend only grew. He became a model for later conquerors. Caesar, Napoleon, and others looked to him as inspiration. Writers turned his life into epic tales. In Persia, India, and the Islamic world he was remembered as Iskandar, a hero and sometimes even a prophet. In the West, he was celebrated as the greatest general of all time. In Babylon, where he took his last breath, the people mourned. Priests conducted ceremonies. His companions could hardly believe the man who had survived every battle was gone. Yet in that silence, the truth stood clear. Even the man who called himself son of Zeus could not escape mortality. Death had claimed Alexander as it claimed all men. Still, his vision did not die. The cities he founded continued to thrive. Alexandria became one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. Greek culture spread far and wide, blending with Egyptian, Persian, and Indian traditions. This fusion, known as Hellenism, shaped art, science, and philosophy for centuries. In this way, Alexander lived on, not as a god but as a force that forever changed history. Alexander's death was both an ending and a beginning. It ended the greatest campaign of conquest the world had ever seen. But it also began a new chapter in human civilization. The empire he created broke apart, but the connections he forged between East and West endured. His dream of reaching beyond known horizons inspired generations to come. And so, in Babylon 323 BCE, the godlike conqueror fell. Yet in memory, legend, and history, Alexander never truly died. His footsteps echoed through time, reminding the world that even in death, greatness can live forever. When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BCE, the world held its breath. He was only 32 years old, but he had already conquered more land than anyone before him. His empire stretched from Greece to Egypt, from Persia to India. Yet in that moment, when his life ended so suddenly, a huge question remained. What would happen to this vast empire without its creator? The empire was too big to be ruled easily. It had been held together only by Alexander's will, his charisma, and the fear he inspired. Now that he was gone, the generals and companions who had marched with him faced an impossible choice. Should they try to keep the empire united under one ruler? Or should they divide it among themselves? The first problem was succession. Alexander left no clear adult heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant, and months later she gave birth to a son, Alexander IV. He also had a half-brother, Aristeus, the son of Philip II by another wife. But Aristeus was mentally unfit to rule. This created confusion. Some generals wanted to wait for Roxana's child. Others wanted to put Aristeus on the throne as a figurehead. The soldiers, who had always loved Alexander, demanded some form of royal blood to continue the line. In the end, a compromise was made. Aristeus was declared king as Philip III, and later the baby Alexander IV was also recognized as king. But both would be controlled by regents, powerful generals who actually ruled in their names. This arrangement created the conditions for endless conflict. The generals, known as the Diadochi or successors, began to fight among themselves almost immediately. They were ambitious men hardened by years of war, each commanding loyal armies. None of them wanted to bow to another. The great empire that Alexander built was soon torn apart by their rivalries. Perdiccas, Alexander's trusted officer, was the first to act as regent. He tried to keep the empire united, ruling on behalf of the two kings. But his authority was challenged. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's companions, took control of Egypt. He was clever, cautious, and ambitious. To strengthen his claim, he stole Alexander's body as it was being taken to Macedonia for burial. Instead, he brought it to Egypt, where it was placed in Memphis and later in Alexandria. By controlling the body of Alexander, Ptolemy also controlled his legacy. Perdiccas marched against Ptolemy but failed. His soldiers mutinied and he was killed by his own officers. This was the beginning of decades of wars known as the Wars of the Diadochi. Antigonus, another of Alexander's generals, established power in Asia Minor. Seleucus gained control over Babylon and later expanded eastward, creating what became the Seleucid Empire. Lysimachus took control of Thrace. Cassander, son of a Macedonian noble, seized Macedonia and Greece. Very soon, Alexander's empire had split into several competing kingdoms. Despite the fighting, the legacy of Alexander remained powerful. Each of these new rulers claimed to be the true heir of Alexander. They built cities, minted coins with his image, and used his name to inspire loyalty. The dream of Alexander's empire lived on even as the reality crumbled. The wars of the successors lasted for more than 40 years. Alliances shifted constantly. One general would rise, another would fall. Families were betrayed, cities burned, and armies destroyed. Eventually, a new balance of power emerged. By around 280 BCE, three great kingdoms dominated the former empire: the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Antigonids in Macedonia and Greece. These kingdoms carried forward the spirit of Alexander's conquest. Greek culture spread across the world in what historians call the Hellenistic Age. Greek language, art, and science blended with the traditions of Egypt, Persia, and the East. Cities like Alexandria in Egypt became great centers of learning. The famous Library of Alexandria collected knowledge from all corners of the world. Philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists flourished in this environment. Alexander's dream of uniting East and West did not survive politically, but it thrived culturally. Greek became the language of trade, administration, and scholarship from the Mediterranean to the Industry. People from different lands exchanged ideas and beliefs in ways that had never happened before. The Diadochi may have fought for power, but they also built lasting legacies of their own. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years until the time of Cleopatra. The Seleucid Empire shaped the politics of the Middle East. The Antigonid dynasty remained important in Greece until the rise of Rome. And Rome itself was deeply influenced by Alexander's memory. Roman generals admired him. Julius Caesar wept when he compared his own achievements to Alexander's at the same age. Later Roman emperors styled themselves as successors to Alexander's greatness. Even centuries after his death, his name carried unmatched weight. Religions also felt his impact. In some traditions, Alexander was remembered as a divine figure. In the East, stories about him entered local legends. In the Persian epic Shahnameh, he appears as Iskandar. In Islamic tradition, some link him with the mysterious figure Dhul Qarnayn in the Quran. His image traveled far beyond the places he actually conquered. But there was also tragedy in his legacy. His empire collapsed quickly because it was built on conquest rather than stable governance. He had not created lasting institutions to hold it together. His generals turned against one another, and his family paid the price. Roxana and the young Alexander IV were murdered in the power struggles, ending the royal line of Alexander forever. Yet despite the bloodshed, his name endured. The cities he founded, especially Alexandria, remained important long after his empire was gone. The blending of cultures that he set in motion shaped the world for centuries. Alexander's legacy was not only political or cultural. It was also personal. He had shown what a single human being could achieve through courage, vision, and relentless ambition. His life became a symbol of limitless possibility, but also of the dangers of boundless desire. Today, more than 2,000 years later, historians still debate Alexander. Was he a visionary who sought to unite the world, or a ruthless conqueror driven only by pride? Was he a hero, a tyrant, or something in between? What is clear is that his impact was enormous. He changed the course of history, leaving echoes that still resonate in our modern world. From the dusty plains of Gaugamela to the shining libraries of Alexandria, from the deserts of Persia to the jungles of India, Alexander's shadow stretched across continents. His empire did not last, but his story became immortal. In the end, the immortal legacy of Alexander is not the empire he built, but the world he transformed. He connected civilizations, spread ideas, and set the stage for the cultures and empires that followed. His name became legend, his life a symbol of greatness, and his death a reminder that even the mightiest conquerors are mortal. Alexander may have died in Babylon, but in the memory of humanity he never truly died. His legacy lives on, immortal, unshaken, eternal.